Okay, on to lane markings. So we talked a lot about all the different signs and different things that they mean. So now I'm going to talk about what the pavement markings, things that you're going to see on the road. So this image is what you'll see while you're driving on the road. You'll always see some lines painted on the road. So a yellow line means that vehicles are traveling in the opposite direction. So definitely be mindful that you're not all traveling together. You have oncoming traffic coming your way when there's a yellow line between you guys. White lines, on the other hand, those mean that vehicles are traveling in the same direction. So be mindful, yellow, opposite, white, same direction. And then these lane markings, whether they're yellow or white, they can either be solid or they can be broken lines, is what they're called. So the solid line means that crossing over that solid line to pass or do a lane change is not permitted. If it's solid, you cannot cross that thing. So think of it as like an imaginary barrier. If it's solid, you can't be passing that line. But if you see how the lane changes and it moves into a broken line, that means that lane changing is permitted. You can go and pass another vehicle if it's safe to do so. If there's nobody in that other lane and you want to switch over because you're going to be preparing to turn, then you can do that only when it's at that broken line. Broken lines on one side means that there's lane changing permitted on the side you're on with the broken line, but there could be a solid line on the other side. So in this instance, it's yellow, so you have traffic moving in opposite directions. And the side on the top, they can do some lane changing. They could pass a slower vehicle if they wanted to, if it was safe, because they have a broken line. But the vehicles traveling at the bottom lane there, they're on a solid line, so they're not permitted to do any lane changing. So definitely be mindful. You can have solid lines together, broken lines together. It's all telling you something that you're allowed to do. So sometimes you might even see a solid double line. So that solid double line means like you are not allowed to, nobody's passing that lane at all, except drivers may only cross that line if they're going to turn left. Into, like, say he's pulling into a house or something like that, or an alleyway, this vehicle, that's the only time he's allowed to cross that single line, is when you're turning, doing a left-hand turn. So he can't just start lane changing over to pass other vehicles because he's impatient. But if he needs to get off of the roadway and do a left-hand turn, that's the only time you're permitted to cross over solid lines. And only when safe to do so. So that brings us to page 38 of your book. Those are where it summarizes all those different lines: broken, solid, yellow, white. Make sure you know what those mean, because they very well could ask you a question on that. Okay, now you might see arrows on a road. So those arrows, as you can imagine, they're telling you what you can do while you're in that lane. So if you can look at those arrows there, one is pointing towards like an alley roadway, and then one is telling you that you can turn here either before the intersection, or if you're going to turn in that intersection, you could probably use that lane. So there'll also be signs telling you what they can do. And in the middle here, you can see how there's arrows pointing in different directions, right? So that's called a shared use lane. That means that traffic from both directions, either direction, could be using that lane to turn left. So those ones, you got to be very, very cautious to make sure that you're not entering that lane too early, because there could be somebody else trying to use that lane to go left in the opposite direction, and you don't want to get into a situation where you guys are both trying to cross at the same time or potentially crash into each other. So definitely be mindful of that you're entering or using that lane in a proper way, and that you're not entering it too early to obstruct other vehicles. We're almost there, trust me. Diamond markings. So these ones, you'll see that white diamond painted on the gray. You will see those on designated lanes, but it'll also be accompanying usually a sign like this one. It's got the diamond on the top with the black, which is telling you black means lane usage, right? Or lane designation. So this is telling you in this lane, usually it's the far right lane in most cases. This far right lane is designated for specific vehicles and at specific times. So this sign, as you can read, it has a picture of a bus and a taxi. It's a little grainy, but it does say taxi. And what it's telling you is that between these hours of 7 and 9 a.m. and 4 and 6 p.m., that's what it means in that army time, and Monday to Friday, if it's any time in those days and times, then buses and taxis are only permitted to use this lane. So again, if you are caught driving in that lane because on Sunday you used it and everything was fine, but now it's Monday morning, you're heading to work and you use that shared road use lane, you could definitely be caught for a fine in traffic. And again, you will see these on 97th Street. Along 97th Street by Yellowhead, they do have designated bus lanes, and that's to help the flow of traffic. There's a lot of buses that travel down that road, so they want to designate those for those commuters that are using those lanes. Sometimes you'll see a carpool too, like in that, but they're not as common. It's usually got to be a taxi in order to use those lanes or a bus. X markings. X markings on a road, they indicate that you're coming and approaching to a railway crossing. So you'll see, you can also not stop in that X line. So where it has an X, it's telling you there's a railway crossing, but it's also telling you you can't stop in this X. And that's to allow yourself enough time away, like give you enough space away from that railway track so that you're not getting too close to put yourself in harm's way. And those are on page 40 of those crossing, those X markings. Okay. Another one is crosswalks. We talked a little bit about crosswalks, but here's what they actually look like. Crosswalk lines are marked and they are for pedestrians to use. So all intersections have crosswalks, even if it's not painted. So even if you're at an intersection and there's no lines, it doesn't mean that there's not a crosswalk. There could be invisible crosswalks where they can go corner to corner. But most of the time you'll see either these lines where it's designated for pedestrians to cross into, or those vertical lines all painted together. Those are all meaning the same thing, a crosswalk. So stop lines show where the vehicles must stop at an intersection or railway crossing. So right there on the bottom image there, it says stop line. So it's telling you got to stop at that line. You can't go farther into it because you're going to be in the crosswalk zone and you're going to be obstructing pedestrians and potentially forcing them to walk, you know, in the way of oncoming traffic, putting them in danger. So be careful. On the other image, there's a crosswalk line, but there's no stop line. You still are required to stop before that crosswalk intersection. Even if there's no stop line, you need to prepare your vehicle to stop before you enter that crosswalk. You're not allowed to be just parked or stopped in crosswalks. You definitely don't want to be obstructing pedestrians. So there's also no stopping zones. These are also marked with an X, but it's like an X with a closed box around it. So this one doesn't necessarily mean that there's a railway crossing, but what it means is there's no stopping in that zone. So you'll often see these posted in bigger intersections where you're coming from a more busy road. And that's usually to allow for bigger trucks. When trucks do turns, especially if they have trailers behind them, they're not able to swing their whole vehicle around very easily. So they often put these no stopping zones to give those trucks bigger, like enough room to make their turns safely. And so you're not obstructing that vehicle from getting through. So always be mindful about those pavement markings on the road because they can mean like your own safety for your vehicle, and it can help you with other road users, right? Always be mindful of what you're doing and also what other people that are using the road are doing.